And in this episode, we are rethinking the pension system. One way to approach this is by watching Tom Cruise, who has reached pension age in some countries, prepare his stunts. And I'm not talking about the stunt itself that lasts a minute, I'm talking about the way he learned new skills and prepare for the big moment. Okay, not many pensioners will look to jump from a cliff on a motorbike.
This is far and away the most dangerous thing we've ever attempted. We've been working on this for years.
But the image of retirement as an off button is obsolete. And the way we fund our retirement also has to evolve. So how is our pension system keeping up? To start this reflection on pension, I have the pleasure to welcome Alyshia Harrington-Clark from the Pension and Lifetime Savings Association. It's a UK organization, but I think you'll see that our conversation has a global relevance. And I must preface that this episode was recorded in November 2024, days before the UK Chancellor announced a pension reform. So whatever you listen to here is not linked to political developments, and it's really an evergreen perspective on pensions, but I also hope it can shed some light on the proposed reform in the UK. Alicia, great to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
I generally start with questions because my guest background is pretty obvious very often. But here, I think that already your title could enlighten us into the pension world. So can you tell us what it means leading the DC Master Trust and Lifetime Savings Policy and Advocacy, please?
Yeah, my job title is often a point of discussion before I even enter the room, to be honest, George. So you've hit the nail on the head there. My job is to look after all of the PLSA's Master Trust and DC policy. Me or my team will always be covering those issues, but you'll have also noticed that I have lifetime savings in my job title, as does the organisation. So the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association was actually a rebrand. It used to be the National Association of Pension Funds. It was a rebrand, at least in part, to acknowledge the changing nature of pensions, and that's why Lifetime Savings also appears in my job title. The way that we split up the work in the team is broadly that some of us look after DC and Master Trust, like I described. That's my team.
Okay, that rebranding is already very interesting because indeed there are many other avenues where we put our investments. I'm talking about the UK. And in fact, all of those eventually contribute to our pensions or to a freedom we want to have at some stage in our life where we don't want to be fully employed. But let's continue hearing from Alicia.
And then we also look after all of the rest of the pensions industry as well. So we look after all of DB, all of local government, all investment issues, ESG issues, all of that sort of stuff too. So we have a very broad mandate, actually. And when we talk about policy, obviously we're a trade association, so we are usually facing off against government. But we do make our own policy too. We have areas where we sort of develop and deliver and propose policy that sometimes ends up looking a little bit like government policy and sometimes doesn't. But we do that on behalf of the whole industry. It's not just one particular element of the industry. So my job title, like you say, looks very sort of DC and Master Trust focused. But in reality, my team covers things like pensions dashboards. We cover some of the investment related issues, particularly recently, as the government has shown us a lot of interest in that in DC. But we also cover other things like artificial intelligence. Someone in my team is currently working on artificial intelligence in pensions. So we cover a lot of different stuff, broad range of issues, and pensions, as you described, is much, much more interesting, I think, than people often assume.
Definitely. Well, that's an exciting start. And I also need to clarify a few concepts. DC, I know it's defined contribution. DB,
Yes.
defined benefit. Master Trust.
So, Master Trusts. Master Trusts are a kind of DC pension in most cases, though, just to add insult to injury, there are actually DB Master Trusts also. But let's start with DC Master Trusts because that's mostly what people are talking about. They're a type of occupational pension. And that is mostly our focus at the PLSA, occupational pensions. And they are used for automatic enrolment predominantly for employees into that workplace occupational pension. It's a kind of like a shared kind of pension, not in a risk sharing context. We can come back to that. That's a very hot topic at the moment in DC as well through CDC, Collective Defined Contribution, but more about who owns the assets, who holds the governance and the responsibility for taking decisions, and also who does a lot of things like communications on behalf of employers, and other administrative functions that employers used to do themselves individually. So it's like a really, really big occupational pension. Very similar to, in theory, though not in practice, to things like supers in Australia. You'll have heard of superannuation funds. Sort of similar-ish model, quite different in practice. And so the idea being that your DC pension is run alongside many other people's DC pensions, many other employers' DC pensions, and that you can therefore get some benefits as a result of that. Increased returns, greater diversification, better cost benefit, that kind of thing, cost efficiency savings. So it's a sort of great big shared DC pension, but it's still a DC pension.
All right. I'm fairly familiar with super. It's because my wife's Australian. But where does my SIP fit into that? Because that's something I'm very familiar with. Is it more like somewhere where employees will have their assets managed on their behalf, whereas the SIP is something where they would do it actively on their own?
Almost exactly and precisely. So the key difference is with a SIP, it's a kind of personal pension rather than an occupational pension in most cases. Again, there are always shades of grey in pensions, so you'll hear me say this a lot. Mostly this kind of language. But yeah, SIPs, generally speaking, are a personal pension. It's something that your employer is not doing for you. You're doing it for yourself. And this means that you might take allocation decisions, you might pick funds or managers, you might decide how much you're paying into it, you might decide who the sort of provider is, all of that kind of stuff. You might pay a platform fee, all of these other kind of factors that you don't need to worry about so much with occupational pensions. Whereas master trusts are much more like a traditional occupational pension where you didn't need to do anything yourself. You don't need to take any choices, unless you want to, of course, you can take choices, but you don't need to. Someone else is governing it, looking after it, paying most of the charges, that sort of thing. So there's a difference in the degree of control that you might have as an individual. Mostly, where people are employed, they would have a SIP alongside an existing occupational pension. It would be a choice that they would do something in addition to their occupational pension. Obviously, if you're self-employed, that's very different. And that's one of the key topics in DC at the moment, is how do you deliver for people that have lots of different types of working pattern. They might be in employment, out of employment, part-time employment, multiple jobs. All of these sorts of things are quite complex when you're looking at a pensions provision, just in general, not just DC, but it's a very hot topic in DC at the moment.
Wonderful. I think that's a very good basis to build on. So thank you very much, Alicia. And I also have to dig a bit further into your background because I can't resist. As I see, you've been involved with the Financial Conduct Authority, with the ESMA, the European Securities and Market Authority. You've worked on MiFID II previously your degree, I skip a few things, right? But you have a degree in philosophy and political economy. So can you tell how does that fit into your current role?
Yes, it is an unusual route to pensions. I often say that I'm a pensions person that knows nothing about pensions. That's a bit disingenuous, but I really didn't come to pensions through the front door. I came to pensions through the back door. My initial interest in pensions came from knowing pension schemes and funds as institutional investors. And obviously they're very significant institutional investors. I knew about them purely because I was working on asset management. The asset management industry at that time was undergoing quite a lot of change as a result of various reviews and inquiries. Institutional investment sort of piqued my interest at that time because we were taking a lot of choices as a regulator about what to do for savers, like you were describing, people that are using a SIP, you know, people with a sort of face and a name. Whereas much of the money, actually, as we all know, comes from institutional investment, which is people all the same, but people in a very different capacity. They're taking a choice on behalf of others. And that really piqued my interest and sort of led me to pensions. But it was from an investment perspective. It wasn't from a sort of true and deep pensions policy perspective. I think that gives me a little bit of a different view on some of the issues in pensions, probably. You mentioned one of my other previous jobs was at ESMA. I was at ESMA as a seconded national expert, which basically just at the time, pre-Brexit, meant that people were sent from the UK alongside other member states to work on particular topics where they could add value. And I worked on financial innovation predominantly and its connection with MiFID II. That work gives me a different perspective on pensions because that work was predominantly about quantifying and deciding and then regulating in theory for risks that were perceived in innovation, in sort of change. And pensions is often, in the UK at least, perceived as sort of kind of old and staid and boring and turgid. And in reality, much of what you see at a European level, at least, in innovation spaces is investment. And therefore, it's just pensions. You know, pensions are just investments, really. Particularly DC pensions are purely deferred income. All you're doing is taking some income that you earn today and saving it up for a later date and taking it as income tomorrow. In DB, that is a bit different. And so the risk balance is in a slightly different place. But in a DC context, it's very much just about risks. It's just about risks and reward. And so I think some of my work at ESMA even, which was about, I worked a lot on crowdfunding and these kinds of things. At that time, again, that was what sort of the hot ticket was. I guess now it would be crypto. You know, those sorts of risk choices that people are making with their money, broadly speaking, is what institutional investors are doing, but on a large scale and in a very sort of protected way. And so I have quite a different view on risk, I think, than the traditional pensions person. Again, DB predominantly has been about liabilities rather than, which I guess is a kind of risk, but it's not quite the same as putting your £1 to future use. And so I tend to sort of think about it in a quite abstract way, I guess, about the sort of value of pensions and what we should be doing for people's future.
Another fascinating response. This idea of the traditional pension person and thinking about liabilities instead of assets is actually something that seems counterintuitive, but I have to ask Alicia about popular culture. Popular culture with movies like The Retirement Plan featuring Nicolas Cage, who's a kick-ass retirement. I mean, kick-ass literally. He's punching and killing people throughout the movie. Or Going in Style, where those guys are actually in their 80s, and they're really active. There are a few things there without overanalyzing. Change of demographic, change of behaviors, and also maybe a prevailing anxiety about the fact that maybe our pensions can be stolen or our retirement can be disrupted. So I've asked Alicia about that.
Sure. So I love the idea of looking at pensions from the context of popular culture. I'm sort of notorious actually for not being very good at popular culture. I've never seen that TV series that everyone's watching on telly kind of thing. But it's very interesting to me, as you describe, that pensions is slightly coming up the agenda. It's sort of become much more, I guess, talked about. And I think there are a couple of very grand reasons for this and a couple of very sort of parochial reasons for this. And I think some of them are about the UK and the UK system, and some of them are much global trends. It's to do with ageing populations and the changing nature of work and the workforce. So on popular culture, I think pensions definitely are scary to a lot of people. This is something we talk about in the industry quite a lot. There's a balance between frightening people so that they could do good and frightening people so they do ill. Frightening people so they do good might be softly reminding people that they currently earn a certain amount of money and they might need, in order to live a similar lifestyle in retirement, a similar amount of money in retirement, and that they should think about how they're going to get there. So, you know, the retirement plan with Nicolas Cage, I mean, it sounds much more like he wasn't doing this, but, you know, sitting down and thinking about in a sort of quite boring ledger style way, what I need and what my hopes and dreams are and how might I pay for that in the future is something that we would always recommend. And we do things like the retirement living standards. We try and encourage people to picture their future, think about your future in terms that could be meaningful to changing your behaviour for retirement saving. So that's sort of spooking people, but spooking people gently so that they realise that there's something that they might need to do, some action they might need to take. Then there's the really scary pension stuff, which is often the stuff that actually grabs the headlines. And this feels more like the going in style, still our pension, pay the price type model, which is scams and fraudulent behaviour and losing all your money and betting on the wrong thing. And we've had a fair share of pension scandals in the past, many of which have really tarnished people's perceptions of pensions. Private pensions that their employer is running, where someone has fraudulently taken the money or it's been invested poorly. But then also people's perceptions of the state pension is often very, very poor. And this brings me on to the sort of comparison with the wider world, really, and some of the wider trends. The state pension in the UK is, though now not currently the most generous in the G20 or any of those kinds of measures, it has very broad cross-party support for continuing to enhance those protections, to enhance the benefits, basically. And it's very protected. So we have the triple lock that's periodically called into question, but predominantly supported by most. And that does quite a lot to adjust for the real cost of living, that most people feel as they retire, and is doing something towards getting all people in retirement out of poverty. It's not there yet, and so there will definitely be proponents that suggest that we need to go much further, and we've long argued that the state pension really should be keeping people out of poverty. Well, state pension plus in retirement state support, which obviously could include things like housing benefit. But broadly speaking, there's a lot of support for the state pension. However, when you speak to people on the street, they believe that they won't get a state pension, or they don't know what it is, or they don't know how much they need to have worked to achieve it, or they've heard things like, oh, well, women don't get state pension, these kinds of misunderstandings. And so there is something more broadly about people's fear about pensions that is leaching into all sorts of decisions that they might be making about life. And this is why I say I've got sort of like slightly grander suggestions as well as to what we're seeing in the UK versus the rest of the world, and just sort of more generally on pensions. There are some big global trends that we're seeing in people's life patterns, is what I'm going to describe. I'm almost exclusively here for the purposes of this discussion talking about sort of modern, post-industrialized capitalist nations. I'm not going to talk about the developing world because it's obviously very different. But if we compare the UK with its peers, most of those nations have seen changing demographic shifts. That has included things like aging populations, but has also, if you dig underneath that, seen greater numbers of people living longer but living in ill health. People might be living longer, and people might be older on average, but more people are poorly. And that happens in the UK, particularly in the working population as well. That's another trend that we're seeing. We're seeing changes in work, people's working patterns, their behaviours, how long they stay in work, how late they start work, when they finish work, do they finish on a cliff edge, or do they sort of take a gentle retirement? Do they change their job somewhat? Maybe they work part-time for 10 years rather than suddenly one day, the Thursday after their 64th and a half birthday comes up and they retire. People don't tend to do that kind of thing anymore. So we're seeing a very different pattern of behaviour in work, and that includes a much more transient workforce, a less stable workforce, much more gig economy workers, those kinds of things, but also sort of shades of grey around that, not true gig economy, sort of shades around gig economy. And that, I guess, brings me on to my final grand point about, which sort of combines these two pieces really, which is that people are living longer and more people are older as a proportion of the total population. Younger people are working differently. And so the gap in generations is opening up in a very unusual way from a historical perspective. So we've all heard people say, oh, I think I'm going to be, richer than my children will ever be. That's pretty much never happened in post-industrialized nations. Pretty much everyone in expectation felt that their children would be richer than them. And this has led to some very interesting factors that are really about pensions, because they're about life in a grand way. How much you earn, who you might live with, how long you might live with them. Do you live with your parents for very much longer? Do you move in with a partner much later? Do you have children later? Do you have children at all? All of these factors are changing the way that people think about their income across a lifetime, and their sort of wealth and assets across a lifetime. Particularly in the UK, though other nations we do see as well, South Africa, Australia, there are extreme costs involved in, for example, housing, for example, transport, that have changed the balance of people's capacity to save. Obviously, that was brought into sharp relief during COVID and the cost of living crisis, but those trends were occurring before, really. They just sort of illuminated what was already happening and accelerated them. And I think that sort of last intergenerational shift in wealth, but also in behaviours, is likely to impact the UK as much as it is the rest of Europe, the rest of Western capitalist societies' views and ability to manage pensions well.
Before we go to the investment side, I also want to ask one thing about the DC versus DB trend. It's pretty much even between DB and DC, whereas I saw a US chart where it shows that they were about equal almost 40 years ago. Since then, it's kind of 90% DC, 10% DB. Is that a trend that we have to see country by country? And the bonus question that goes with that comes from a previous interview that I had with one of the CEO of IG Group, June Felix.
In countries where they have already moved to defined contribution, that more people have had to participate in markets in order to ensure that they don't get left behind. And that's certainly in Asia and also in the US. If there is no defined benefit, people are very hungry to learn and be engaged.
I think the DB to DC balance is very interesting. DB, in terms of AUM, is about 1.5 trillion UK pounds, GB pounds. In 2030, so about 5-6 years from now, it's going to be about the same. The reason for this is because about 300 billion of DB assets are open assets, and about 1.2 trillion are closed. And so you can imagine that balance shifts over time. You would expect more and more of the remaining schemes to be open as a total balance, but that's only because all the closed schemes are closed. So their assets reduce over time. However, in terms of numbers of members, there's about 12 million. Let's shift to DC, and I will add local government in as well in a second, because I think local government is often underestimated in terms of scale and size. The DC is about 20 million as compared with the 12 million members. However, it's only about between 400 and 600 billion. It depends what you count as DCs. By 2030, it's going to be about 950 billion to a trillion. So you can see that the growth is all in DC, basically. But DB doesn't disappear in that time. It stays about the same. And so the 50-50 split that you see is pretty much what I would expect. Just to throw in local government, though, about 6 million members in local government schemes. And local government schemes are about 300 billion in and of themselves. So, and they're effectively a DB scheme. But what people don't often realise is that LGPS is growing. So by 2030, we're estimating about 500 billion in assets in local government pension schemes. Because they're open, they continue forever in perpetuity, effectively. And so the shift is not quite how people often assume. I think people think that, the new interesting bit of pensions is DC. That's true to a certain extent, but actually the balance of assets, are not in my area for quite a while. It's a really long time before you could expect DC to outweigh the others in terms of AUM. In terms of true number of members, though, people on the ground with pensions out there in the real world, most of them are DC. So it's about 20 million. So, if you talk to a person on the street, in most cases, it's going to be me or someone in my team looking after something that is relevant to them. But the assets are not necessarily sat with DC. And this comes to a sort of wider point, I guess, about investing culture and we're doing about that. Are the people of the UK natural investors? I think it depends whether they're taking active choices themselves. So in the UK, traditionally speaking, we haven't needed to take active investment choices ourselves because we've had fantastically well-run DB schemes where someone with very much more expertise than us has been taking those decisions for us. And they have done incredibly well on average in terms of protecting those assets and paying out those liabilities and making sure that you receive your pension in the future. And most people with DB provision currently, like today, their DB provision will be much, much more beneficial to them than their DC provision because DC is just a deferred income. DB has all sorts of associated benefits, guarantees, all of these lovely things that just have completely disappeared in a DC universe. So I think people haven't had an investing culture because they haven't had to. It's not because we're sort of naturally risk averse or something odd. It's because we just haven't needed to take those choices. I think there is a definite likelihood that people will need to become more investment focused, but I think there is a risk in that. We've seen in younger people, their interest is much, much more in investment, partly because of environmental concerns or governance concerns or sort of social concerns. These are driving people to look at investment in a very, very different way. And I think that's a good thing. It does, however, lead also to the risk that people are lured by things that sound exciting or high returning or green or whatever it is that might not actually be in their best interest. And we're in a bit of an interesting space at the moment, just sort of in history with the UK. Our investment culture is coming of age at a time when there's lots of available information out there that may or may not be accurate or safe or appropriate. Mm-hmm. And so we might uniquely be in a space where we are more interested in investment, but that weirdly does us some damage net. Whereas if, we had stayed governed within really heavily governed environments like DC pensions, like master trusts I were talking about earlier, or provided pensions, that's safer than going online and, bet share or whatever. But there are lots of unusual avenues that people are following now.
Well, sure. But let's look at what's happening now on this side and what do we see as the key initiative and potential changes. Maybe we can look at it at various aspects from regulation to industry.
I think let's start with DB first quickly. I think in defined benefit, some of the biggest changes that are, from an investment perspective, coming over the horizon are that historically DB has been about paying liabilities, and I described that already. That's a very sort of specific mandate and approach and objective. And so, there is sort of liability matching and all these sorts of things that you do in investment to meet those needs. There's also been at a regulatory level, though, however, over many years, an interest in effectively allowing schemes to close. What they've been facilitating is employers deciding to take choices that they don't want to continue with their DB scheme, and so they want them to be fully funded or overfunded, and so that those decisions can be made so that they can to move on, to move beyond running that scheme in sort of in perpetuity. That has led to some changes in the way that regulation perceives certain risk-seeking or liability matching behaviours that probably will be looked at in a slightly different light now that so many schemes are so well funded. we've sort of switched overnight after the gilts
Okay.
crisis to having schemes that were predominantly unfunded, not well funded, to those that are mostly very well funded. And so that has probably changed the dynamic a little bit from a government perspective. In DC, the government and regulatory focus on investment has shifted much more towards UK alternative assets. What do I mean by that? I wouldn't want to hedge a bet, to be honest, because the government itself hasn't been super clear what it means. It uses lots of different terms interchangeably to suggest that they want sort of greater risk seeking, greater UK focused assets, bit more risk on, bit more UK.
One acronym that I saw is LTAF.
Yeah, LTAFs. Long-term asset funds. So they're one of the many initiatives that the government has tried in recent, well, that was actually really the regulators have tried in recent times to shift the UK DC industry towards more risk-seeking assets, basically. The problem is some of these assets that the government is interested in theoretically either don't exist, like from a pipeline perspective, they're not there, there just aren't the opportunities that they describe, even theoretically, or they're very expensive or very, very risky. And so from a DC perspective, if you're sort of playing around with one person's pound that they're hoping to live off in the future and it might be £1.20, you're probably not going to necessarily be super keen to throw that money into either very, very expensive or very, very risky assets in a very overweight way. You might allocate a small amount, but you're not going to allocate nearly the sorts of percentages that the UK government would love to have in order to, facilitate infrastructure projects and whatnot. So there are two sort of different drivers here that the government is grappling with. It's their own interests in trying to get UK productive assets and UK growth and a green economy and all of these very highly admirable things, and I wouldn't diminish the need for all of those things. But the problem is, from a sort of UK DC perspective, they're not necessarily the most attractive assets that you would select as an investment professional on behalf of others. And so there are some different benefits and risks associated with those assets that the government is trying to look at. They've looked at, like you said, things like LTAFs. They've looked at things like the charge cap. They've tried to think about, fiscal incentives. There are all sorts of different factors that they've been listening to us on predominantly. But, ultimately, sadly, if the UK underperforms its peers, like as a global economy, if the UK underperforms, then they just don't look that attractive as assets. So regardless of whether they're alternative or not, it's a bit of a difficult one. We're constantly struggling to suggest those things that would make a meaningful difference if that's the government's intent.
Yeah, I totally get it from a UK perspective. Let's say, okay, we're going to invest in growth industries, green industries, in the UK, and those will perform fantastically. This is not a prediction, it's a hypothetical quote. And we're solving all the problems at once. Growth,
100%.
green, pension. What's really interesting from what I hear is the dynamics, what do you call it, a negotiation or an ongoing discussion, and it's between the government and who is on the other side.
Yeah, I'm not sure per se it's a sort of negotiation. It's more just an ongoing discussion and meeting of minds, I would say. It's more about trying to find ways to meet that sort of sweet spot of ultimate goals combined, like you described. Ideally, we'd all have all of those things. We would balance growth, we would balance member outcomes, we'd do that in a well-governed structure. There'd be loads of assets, there'd be a pipeline of investable assets, there'd be fiscal incentives for UK stuff, there would be big industrial strategy with green transition. All of these things, ideally all of these things would happen. So I think it's not per se like a negotiation, it's more just been everyone trying to find the piece of the puzzle that they can add to that UK growth dynamic.
Ultimately, from the pension members or the ultimate beneficiary, what matters with this money is how do I retire, right?
Yes. 100%.
Maybe there's something about, I feel even better in my retirement because I've done green, meaningful project. If I'm being very cynical, I would say, maybe, and looking back, and it's past performance, doesn't mean like it's the future results. The whole UK, the whole universe would have been done very well by investing simply in the S&P 500 of US equities because they've done so well.
Yeah.
What I really like to keep from that is that it's a trade-off and it's being discussed, and it's not like the UK will say, or the government can say, whatever, we do a special fiscal incentive, and now we kind of force you by changing the regulation, and everybody's going to go there. It's natural that they push this way, and it's natural that the industry can enter the dialogue and see how they can do it.
I think it's a dialogue, and I think also it's about those assets. It's finding the assets, finding the opportunities, and if they're there, pension schemes will have them. Pension schemes will never shy away from the things that they need, and it's just that sometimes their needs are a bit more complex than it appears. And you're right, on an individual basis, some individuals are taking choices about their savings that are about green economy or about whatever their ethical or otherwise views about the future society in which they want to live, and that's not necessarily about return, though it could be. It's sometimes about their feeling towards that future society that they want to build. And some pension schemes are taking choices like that as well, but it's not that straightforward. You can't have an ethical perspective in quite the same way as a very, very large investor. It's just not how it works. So I think it is about balancing that, the two sides of the coin. It's about finding those opportunities and those opportunities meeting the needs of savers. And that's hard. It's not straightforward.
Yes. And that, it's a deep question. I think we've got a really good overview of what's set up, what's happening, what are the big questions. And also the fact that the UK is doing quite okay. There's no alarmist thing. It's surprising. I just watched a documentary called The Pension Gamble, which is about how Kansas pension trusts have disastrous investment and forcibly move people who believe they were in a DB into a DC, and horror stories, which you can imagine, right? Bad investment, people taking huge commissions, etc. So well done, the UK on that. Yeah. And there's a lot of things that can be happening. Allocation is one, education and behavior changes, etc. is one. How do you see the most important issues, and do you think there's a tech solution to some of those?
I think there are definitely tech solutions to some of the biggest issues. Some of the biggest issues that we see in DC are about people just bluntly not saving enough. That could be facilitated through changes in government policy. The PLSA have long proposed that the government should increase the minimum automatic enrolment rate to 12% total. So there are things that you can do at a sort of structural level, but also that there are things that you can do on a technology level that facilitate people looking at what they have, taking better choices with what they have, and also doing a better job when they actually come to retire to meet the needs that they foresee that they will have in the short and long term. And some of that is about technology. Some of it is about pensions dashboards. You'll be able to see all your pensions all in one place. That will be highly beneficial to anyone that needs to decide, should I be saving more? How can I be planning for my retirement? Do I even have a pension? All of those basic questions are very, very helpful through pensions dashboards. But I think also, we've long looked at issues in pensions decumulation, and DC decumulation is ultimately a decision about unknowns. I don't know when I'm going to die. So I don't know how long my money needs to last me. And there are some things that technology can do to help inform some of those unknowns. Some of them might be considered to be a bit dystopian, but it might be about what postcode I live in and how wealthy I am and how much I walk every day. And that might tell me something that is helpful for me to understand as to how long I'm likely to live. And so, some people, like I say, consider that stuff dystopian, but I consider that just just information. I would love to know that so that I could take a better choice. So I think there are illustrations that can be done via technological solutions that can help people to understand their overall wealth better. Pictures, diagrams, drag bars, all of these things really help people to be able to take better choices. And so I think there are a lot of probably really very low rent technological solutions that would be really fascinating and helpful to most people in taking choices. And ultimately with DC, the risk sits with you. It sits with you as an individual. It is not DB. It doesn't sit with your employer. That risk has to be better understood by individuals, and technology can help with that.
Yeah. I just had my insurance send me like cinema tickets before I did that number of steps, which is measured by my phone, and I'm not doing the steps to get the cinema tickets, but I think, how nice incentive. I can see how those things can help. And when you say people looking at it, it's kind of the UX aspect of things. If I may, as a last question, and to wrap this up, sometimes we play this fintech fantasy game where we can imagine, and there's no restrictions, right? How it looks in an ideal world. So how does it look for you in an ideal world, let's say in 10 years, in terms of where we are at? What kind of tools have I got to monitor my pension? How much do I contribute to it? And what other kind of rosy things could work out?
Wow, that is a fascinating question, and one I've never been asked before. What would I pick? My fintech fantasy? I would pick a few different things, I think. I would like to be able to know with confidence that a well-established, well-governed organisation is looking after my pension assets for me, whether they're all in one place or across multiple places doesn't bother me. And I would like to be able to see some of that decision making that they've taken at the click of a button. So I'd like to be able to say, oh yes, they voted in this way on this thing because they didn't believe in that company's social agenda. I'd like to be able to see that just at a click of a button. I'd like my small pots to be resolved. So I'd like my small pots to not be all over the place. I'd like to know that there is a process by which they are gathered together and that I don't need to worry about that myself. I don't need to take any action. They're just gonna be cleaned up. I would like to be able to toggle between my decumulation choices. So I'd like to be able to look at a comparison between, well, if I were to purchase an annuity versus if I were to use drawdown, at a projected age, let's say 70, what would my income look like? How much rent would I be able to afford? Therefore, some sort of interactive toggling so that I could take a choice about, actually, right at this minute, it probably doesn't look like a good idea for me to save more. Maybe what I should be doing is putting some money away in order to buy a bigger house or whatever, some kind of wider financial decision. Yeah, maybe it's a time for a bit of risk or something. And I think the other thing I would like to feel that was, like I said, available. So I think one of the things that when you speak to people, when we do like Vox Pops and things like that, people often say that they don't really feel like their pension is their own. They have this perception that it's, someone else is doing it for them, that they might lose it, that someone else is taking decisions on their behalf, and that they don't have any way of looking at it. They don't even know where it is. They don't know what it looks like. They don't know what it's doing. It might disappear. And so I would like to feel that it was mine in a more immediate way. And that might just be that I can see it very straightforwardly on my phone. I don't want to obsessively worry about it, but I do want to have access to it, I think.
Yeah, I can picture this, very elegant UX dashboard available for everyone with all the information aggregated, but not just technical and financial.
Yes.
Very user-friendly.
Very user-friendly.
I feel empowered. I contribute the right amount.
Yeah, and I could just toggle it out this month.
We've solved it.
Yeah, it would be great.
I think that's all we have time for, Alicia, but this has been a wonderful, enlightening journey into the world of pension. So I'm very grateful for that. I think we've got a much clearer view of where we are, how we're doing, and where we're potentially going in the UK. So I'm very grateful. And do you want to tell us where people can find you, follow you?
Yeah, of course. So I think one of the best places to look is the Pension and Lifetime Savings Association website. We also have a Twitter X feed, and we have a quite active LinkedIn as well. So just search Pension and Lifetime Savings Association. You'll find me and my team members and all of the rest of the team. We do a lot of big conferences every year, usually 3 flagship large conferences, which are great places to come and to hear more about what's going on in pensions and what we're doing and what all our members are up. I think also the other pluggable I would have is the Pay Your Pension Some Attention campaign. Just Google Pay Your Pension Some Attention or Pensions Gemma Collins, and you'll find lots of very off-the-wall pensions content, which you wouldn't necessarily expect the pensions industry to be providing to the universe. But it's a yearly campaign, and this one was supported by Gemma Collins. So there's some very, very funny GIFs and whatnot if you're interested in spreading the word about pensions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alicia. As I reflect on this conversation with Alicia, I see that Tom Cruise is releasing a new movie in 2026, Top Gun: Retirement.
I'm no longer working for U.S. Marine Corps.
But it looks like this retirement is a new beginning.
I've decided to become a commercial pilot.
I think that can help us again reflect on our pension as an opportunity to change direction, change pace, but only if we can control it. In the next episode of this series on pensions and retirement, I want to explore the tech angle. We discussed this fantasy fintech with Alicia. Could new interfaces, new tool bring a new level of awareness and a new era where everybody decides to be involved in their pension and controlling their pension? Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.